Here we are remembering when in our youth, New Atheism had so much currency and power. But we're now living through a moment when the New Atheists themselves are scrambling for some sort of purchase against all sorts of new spiritualities that have effectively stampeded by their grand, rational, utopian future. And you see things happening like, of course, Dawkins recently said, I'm a cultural Christian, meaning I prefer Christmas lights and churches to radical Islamism and woke chicanery. And he's saying that because he recognizes implicitly that you need some kind of foothold with which to answer these neo-theologies that are coming into being. But what he doesn't quite, I think, grasp yet is that those neo-theologies have power because of the giant gap that he tore open in his own philosophy and left kind of unaddressed, that like we're all sort of, Darwinianism, the power of Darwinian evolution sort of explains our origins, and from this we can derive things like our moral preferences. I mean, if you read The Selfish Gene, he sort of gets to this point where he says, well, why should we still be moral even though we are the product of these sort of raw self-reproducing forces? And he says, because something, something, something. Like, isn't it great that we're able to make those sorts of choices? And of course, that's a giant open wound that's just waiting to be filled by some moral system. And so, to me, I think like the woke era really is the era when this bill comes due in a very big way. And we can't help anymore facing up to the theological nature of our thought in its very structure. Now, I don't think that Dawkins is ever going to bite that bullet. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I want to leave the possibility that he will. But I'm really talking to the people who are a little bit younger, a generation younger, and realize that there's something missing from this way of looking at things, but don't want to, quote unquote, get spiritual or get theological. I sort of want to show in this book that they already are spiritual and theological. And if that's the case, then perhaps it would be best to think more seriously and soberly about what a healthy spirituality would look like.
No, and so there's kind of two categories of atheists, and Dawkins, I think you characterized perfectly, because he's also said things like, I'm starting to realize that, I don't think God exists, but people are going to steal less if they think that he does. And so maybe, belief in God is good. And so there's a few people that are essentially coming to the conclusion that the peasantry probably does need an opiate, like they probably do need this. And so there's people who are recognizing the social utility of some of these things. Like, we need Christianity, we just don't need Christ. And then on the other hand, there's people who are grappling with it, I think, more deeply. Guys like Douglas Murray, who wrote an essay for The Spectator like 10 years ago called Ethics for Atheists, where he says if we can't hammer one out, he says it's going to be Jesus or the furnace, is basically what the conclusion of his essay was. And I think that he's right. But before we sort of get into that, this is another thing that your book addresses, because your book is so many different things. It's apologetics, it's a story, it's a counter narrative. I actually found it hard to categorize it as I was going through it. I'm like, this is definitely apologetics. Nope. No, this is just really interesting history. Nope, this is genealogy. And so I wanted to hear your take. So there's a number of fascinating theories, most of them overlapping on how the West became secular, right? We mentioned Charles Taylor. I think Mary Eberstadt's book, How the West Really Lost God, A New Theory of Secularization, is phenomenal. In your view, how did the scientific revolution contribute to the collapse of religious faith? Because even when you look at the period where these debates were taking place at a high level, when Thomas Huxley's debating Samuel Wilberforce on Darwinism and things like that, when you look at rates of church attendance, when you look at people's spiritual beliefs, when you look at how they practice things like, prayer, it didn't have much of an impact while it was happening and when these debates between these sort of intellectual titans were dominating the headlines. And so how do you think that it contributed in terms to the rise of the nuns and the sort of collapse of metaphysical meaning we see now?
Well, I think the short answer is that scientific materialism, or the rise of the scientific method, facilitated a divorce between the mind and the body of the West. And what I mean by this is you get a point at which the intellectual elite are operating on principles that, if embodied, if acted out, would destroy comfortable, polite society. Things like humanity is a random product of atomic motion. And for a time, what seems to happen is that you get people basically acting as if we're all just meat sacks in the laboratory, but wishing to persist as if we are embodied souls with a kind of obligation to virtue in the London high society, in the clubs, right? And this is the state of affairs that Nietzsche, I think, is really observing. I think that when Nietzsche's sort of raving in the streets about the death of God and driving himself crazy, wondering why nobody sees it, nobody realizes what's going on, I think he's observing almost before anyone else, with the possible exception of Dostoevsky. He is observing this cognitive dissonance that has started to emerge between the premises of the new science and the premises of traditional bourgeois morality and society. And this is fine if science is something that bourgeois people do kind of in a restricted and rarefied atmosphere, which initially it was, right? I mean, we've talked now at some length about the fact that at first, science is something that religious people do in a domain that doesn't require religious assumptions. And so it's possible to shelve some of your religious preconditions, understand that they're there, and then move into the laboratory and figure out, like, you know, the reproductive cycle of the gnat or whatever you're looking at. If, though, science is not just natural philosophy, not just one branch of knowledge, but is scientia, full stop, that is knowledge itself, is Wissenschaft, is science, then at a certain point, the clash between these two very different systems of thought is going to have to come to a head. And I think it's Nietzsche who sees, well, if your science is delivering all of these immediate results, and all your virtue and your ethics and your theology can offer you is sort of inconvenient claims upon your desires, then eventually you are just going to, your vestigial religious impulses are going to be cannibalized by your real belief, which is in science and the material world. And because the people who would otherwise have defended religion were only able to do it on cultural rationalist grounds and not ready really to do it on purely, you know, to really bite the bullet and go for theological, yes, the resurrection actually happened kind of grounds. It was probably inevitable that religion was going to lose that fight to science, which could demonstrate its claims. But this is, you know, after Nietzsche, this is the entire corpus of C.S. Lewis, I think, is well explained as an effort to insist upon this kind of Pauline idea that, no, if you really want to make a rigorous intellectual defense of the faith, you're going to have to do it with affirmative claims about miracles, about the resurrection, about, you know, the historicity of Jesus, the Son of God. And I think that now, when you talk about people like Douglas Murray and Tom Holland, and I would add Ayaan Hirsi Ali in there, all of these people who are grappling with the sort of essential roots, the essential Christian roots of our civilization, they are all struggling with and finding their various answers to this exact question. Is it possible to preserve Christian morality against the flood tide of materialist nihilism and its kind of the trail in its wake of woke neo-theology? Or do we really have to plunk for old-time religion? And somebody like Hirsi Ali basically says, no, you got to plunk. It's, you know, this is a reason to become a Christian. Others are unsure. There's people like Marcello Pera who say, no, we just have to call ourselves Christians. At the far end, there's Dawkins, right? We're just going to be cultural Christians. But everybody is kind of grappling with this issue right this moment. And it has to do with this many hundreds of years during which our physical philosophy and our metaphysical philosophy have been at odds with one another. And one of them is going to have to eat the other one up, essentially.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.